Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest in our series of virtual Voices of the Game programs from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We're so glad that all of you could join us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Marcus, and I work in the Education Department. And it's my pleasure today to have a really good friend of me personally, but also a friend of the Hall of Fame. He has been an anchor at the MLB Network since 2011. He has hosted the show MLB Now since 2013. Also since 2017, he has been the Master of Ceremonies for our Hall of Fame weekend. He is the Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, Brian Kenny, who joins us on the line today. Brian, welcome to the program. How you doing?
Thank you, Bruce. It's good to see you. Good to talk to you again.
You're not actually at your permanent home. You're in a different location with a beautiful fire going in the background. So this is our unofficial fireside chat.
This is like FDR himself. Yes, we're just getting out of winter, but yeah, we've had the fire going on since we've been in quarantine. So the family is up here, and we're all healthy and safe, and I hope you guys are all the same in Cooperstown.
We're going to cover a lot of different topics. We're going to talk to Brian about what a typical day for him would have been like at MLB Network prior to this quarantine situation that we're in. We'll talk about his work, of course, as Master of Ceremonies. Sadly, this year, we will not be able to have an induction. It's, I know, something that Brian always looks forward to, so we'll get his thoughts on that. And we'll even talk to him about some of the other personalities that he knows at MLB Network. Some interesting characters like Eric Byrnes and Christopher Russo, among others. So we'll get into a lot of different topics during today's show. But Brian, I wanted to begin with growing up as a baseball fan. And for you, we have something in common. One of your favorite player growing up, this man, Bobby Murcer, was once a terrific star for the New York Yankees. I grew up as a Yankee fan, and Bobby was one of my two favorite players. It was Murcer and Thurman Munson.
Sure.
Tell us why Bobby Murcer became your personal favorite.
Well, probably it was that sweet spot of where I'm, in Little League, and Bobby Murcer is the star center fielder of the New York Yankees. Right. Thurman Munson would emerge as a great player, but when I'm a little kid, Bobby Murcer was the guy. And it's funny, you look back on his best years, 1970, 71, 72. He was a marvelous player. So, sure, I loved a lot of the Yankees. My father would take me to both Shea Stadium and Yankee Stadium. And so I loved the Mets too. Not as much as the Yankees, but obviously the Mets were very good back then. Tom Seaver, John Matlack, John Milner, those players, but the Yankees with Munson and Bobby Murcer were my favorites. And later, when I was a broadcaster, when I was with ESPN, went down and covered spring training, and we had done some interviews with the team. And spring training, you do most of your stuff in the early morning. Then there's a game at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I had nothing to do but watch the game between the Yankees and somebody else. And I looked for a place to sit. And there was this a TV booth, but there was no TV crew there at the time. So I just went in, and it was Bobby Murcer. So I introduced myself, and this maybe it's 20 years ago at this point, 18 years ago. And I saw Bobby there, and I introduced myself, and I was thrilled. I told him how I loved him as a player growing up. And he said, "Why don't you have a seat?" And I was like, "Oh my God." And I sat there and watched like 5 innings of a Yankee spring training game with Bobby Murcer, who is, of course, since passed away. But what a thrill, and what a good guy. Just a pleasure, a gentleman, great disposition, everything you hope he would be. And I'll always remember those innings that I had sitting with Bobby Murcer and, getting to hear what he had to say about the Yankees.
I was crushed, perhaps even devastated, when I learned that he'd been traded to the San Francisco Giants for Bobby Bonds. What was your reaction? Do you remember?
Yeah, it made no sense. Now, Bobby Bonds was a tremendous player. I mean, again, even back then, Bruce, I was looking at the numbers, and this guy was hitting home runs and stealing bases, but it was heartbreaking. Even though I knew, well, it's exciting to get Bonds, I thought, no, how can you trade Bobby Murcer? So, yeah, I remember that as well.
Yeah. They were two players that really seemed like on a collision course with the Hall of Fame. Didn't work out that way. Bobby, of course, was traded. He struggled in San Francisco somewhat, then went to the Cubs. Really was not fully happy, though, until he returned to New York. And by then, he was more of a role player. Bonds was a player who did not age particularly well for a number of reasons. But, boy, at one time, Bonds and Murcer, early 70s, these guys, they seem like certified Hall of Famers.
Right. And it points out something, too, because Bruce, when we talk about Hall of Famers, it's easy to focus on a certain level of player. But in any given year, we know that the greatest players or the best players of that season might not end up being Hall of Famers, but kind of what I call a peak Hall of Famer, maybe for a short period of time. And Bobby Murcer was one of the best players in baseball for a short period. You can say that about Don Mattingly or Dale Murphy, that there are certain players who, for a 2 to 3 year period, and maybe with Murcer and Bonds, it's kind of shorter, they're among the best players in the game. But I think there's a place too. If you and I have this conversation with a lot of the writers at MLB Network, and I say, hey, if we were hanging out at the Otis Saga, 1934, trying to imagine what the Hall of Fame was supposed to be, we might imagine it for that type of Don Mattingly, Dale Murphy sort of player. We might not have to have 20 years or 15 years of excellence. Maybe 3 to 4 years of true greatness is what we would look at. I think there's a way still of looking at both and rewarding both.
Brian, let's talk about growing up as a baseball fan. For me, the influence to get into baseball was very clear. My father, he was a Mets fan and a baseball fan in general, so I naturally grew into baseball, but I was a bit rebellious because I didn't follow the Mets. I followed the team he didn't like, the Yankees. How about you? How did you get started? Was there one person or one influence, or was it a combination of things?
Well, it was my father as well. And I would later look at it and understand it a little better because my father, like a lot of our dads, he was my Little League coach for a number of years. But he had to teach himself the game. He emigrated from Ireland when he was 19 years old. He was a New York City policeman, became an NYPD highly decorated detective. And so he's raising me, and he played hurling as a kid. He had a hurling stick and the ball, if Irish hurling, that sport. It's a pretty crazy sport, but he didn't know baseball at all. And I think for my father, and also in the house with us growing up, were my mother's parents. So I had my maternal grandparents there as well. They also both off the boat, off a farm in Ireland. And so I would go to ball games, Shea Stadium, Yankee Stadium. We would go to Cooperstown with my father, with my grandfather. And I think for my father, Charlie Kenny, and my grandfather, Michael Fletcher, for them, baseball was about being an American. And it was a big part of being an American, of coming to New York, this glorious place. And there were all of these teams in the 50s, since whittled down, to the Yankees and the Mets, no Giants and Dodgers, but it was a glorious heyday of baseball for them. And I think for them, being an American, following baseball, being into baseball, being part of the American culture was very important. Baseball was a huge part of that.
Brian, I've known you for years. I had no idea that your father was a policeman. Did you ever consider that as a possible career?
Yes, I did. I was, as they say, on the list. But when I'm getting out of college and I've gone to St. John's, I then went to New York Institute of Technology. I am on the list for the police forces, like most of my friends that I was working with, for NYPD, Nassau County, Suffolk County, taking the tests, taking the physical, taking the psychological. And I thought, well, this is a nice dream to have, to be a journalist. But, to me, being a journalist seemed possible, but it was kind of like, back then at least, like being in the movies. Like who gets to do that? Be ready to get a job. You better be ready to work. Don't be thinking you're going to be a movie star. You're going to be on, who are you? You're going to be on TV. But I really thought, I'm going to try. I was fortunate enough to be able to do some TV at New York Tech. We had a news station called LI News Tonight. And I was, a Cub reporter in college. was able to put together a resume tape, and I was able to get small jobs. I worked at TV 55 out on Long Island. It was my first full-time gig as a reporter. And once I started getting those jobs, I thought, I'm going to try to work in media. And at a certain point, if I have to get a real job, I'll get a real job and I'll be a policeman. But no, I was able to stay on TV as a reporter, then later as a sportscaster, and I guess I haven't worked since. I've been doing this ever since. But this is my dream, obviously, especially now on a regular basis, to be able to write about baseball, broadcast baseball, talk baseball. You and I are talking about Bobby Murcer right now. I mean, it's a dream come true. But yes, I was prepared to be on the job, as they say back then.
Well, I think your career choice worked out pretty well. You mentioned a moment ago coming to Cooperstown as a youngster, and it's become either your favorite destination or one of. You come here every year. Your daughter's wedding took place at the Otis Saga in Cooperstown. Tell us exactly why it is that you love this village so much.
Well, we've just been coming for years. I've gone up when my wife and I were in upstate New York, and we have 5 children. So as you start having kids and more kids, you still want to get away occasionally. Our parents could watch some of the kids depending on how many we had or how many babies we had, but we could make a drive to Cooperstown. It's like, we get away for a weekend. And so my wife Coco and I have been able to make escapes through the years. And then as the kids were getting older, we would come up in the wintertime. I know people think that's crazy, but as you know, Cooperstown has a winter festival. It's beautiful with the snow. So we have been coming up every year for our anniversary and just enjoying it and coming up year round, trying to make trips when we can. I would make trips when my father was alive to bring him up with my sons. And then, yes, eventually I did not make my daughter get married there in Cooperstown. That was her choice. She was on her own mission with her mother, with my wife, looking at different places. And she saw the Otis Saga and had seen it all through her life. But then looking for a place to get married, she said, this is perfect. So I didn't make them do it. And actually she texted me. I was sitting on the set of MLB Now, sitting next to George Will when he was on the show. And I said, my daughter's getting married at the Otis Saga. And he said, well, you can't beat that. And I thought, yes, no, you can't beat that. So that really brought it forward. But we've always loved coming there. You live there. It's a beautiful village, and it brings back so many memories of baseball and just of, what we hope the country can be, kind of just this small town, bucolic setting. And we can think back to when we were kids, and you can occasionally see the great ball players come through, and through the years we've gotten to meet them, and that's a terrific experience. So yeah, it's a long time love affair.
In 2017, you got an offer that you simply could not refuse, the chance to become the Master of Ceremonies for a Hall of Fame weekend. When that first came up, how'd you react to it?
I remember Rob McGlarry, the MLB Network president, telling me at the winter meetings. We were having dinner together, and he told me, and it's almost like you get news that's so good you don't know how to react. I was thrilled. I've been watching the ceremony since the 80s. Got to cover it and host it in a TV sense for ESPN and then for MLB Network. But the thought of being the man on stage, especially doing the roll call of greats, and being able to introduce one great player after another on the stage I can't even find the words. It's so fantastic. It's a great responsibility. I take it very seriously. And I've been going to the ceremony for so many years. I know you and so many of the guys that work there at the Hall of Fame for so many years. It really feels like family. So when I look out at the vast crowd, it's intimidating, but I know these are our baseball people. This is our baseball family. And being there with the Hall of Famers through the years now, especially the last few years where I'm right there with them throughout the whole process, they feel like family. So I'm very much at home, but it's quite a thrill, as you know, to peek your head out and peer out at that field and look at, the last few years, 45, 50, 55,000 people, and know that now it's my time to introduce the Hall of Famers. So it is my favorite thing to do. It's a thrill each and every year.
It's obviously a very prestigious duty, but people might not realize how hectic and how difficult it is. Everything is timed. You have to get the introductions done quickly. I'm sure sometimes you're told, well, we've had to change the order. One of the Hall of Famers maybe couldn't get here exactly when we expected. It's not that easy.
It's funny. I know it takes concentration, and I'm used to concentrating for periods of a time doing a show, but how many Hall of Famers do we introduce, Bruce? Is it 50, 40, somewhere between 45 and 50? If
some
you
years
think
up
about,
to 60.
What's that?
Up to 60 some years.
Maybe. Oh, yeah, probably right. With the new class coming in, you're right. Maybe that's one of the biggest classes, and then the new class coming in. There are definitely times where I have to just, summon my focus, because you do one, you do another, and then, ladies and gentlemen, Henry Aaron, and you turn around and you bask in that moment, and now I go back to the podium, and I'm thinking, where was I? Like, oh no, who's next? Like, don't veer from the script too far, because we have specific things that we want to say. You have to keep each introduction very tight. You want to elaborate much more. Each player has had such a fantastic, obviously, each one has had great moments, a fantastic career, but you have to keep it tight. But when you start getting up around 25, 30 players, 35 players, I do have to just kind of get into that mode of focus and, enjoy. I try to enjoy myself and smile and relax, but then you've got to get, wait, we got 15 more. You've got to get back to it. So it's not a hardship, but it's a thrill, and you do have to try to stay in. I have a job here. I need to keep these all-time greats coming out, and then we have to get to the ceremony.
It's also different from being in the studio. If you have to cough, or if you even have to get up from your seat, well, they can always take the camera off you and put it on someone else, or they can show a video. But when you're out there on that stage and there's 40 to 50,000 plus people, there's no hiding.
Well, I think that's actually, it didn't occur to me until I was sitting there, because I didn't know, where do I sit? What do I do? Once I've done the roll call, and I have a few more duties to do introductions and do a few different things. But a lot of the times I just sit down, and I'm seated, right there with Jane Forbes Clark, chairman of the Hall of Fame, and I'm there with the Presidential Hall of Fame, but I'm right behind the podium. And I know at any moment, either everybody there is looking at, Jim Thome or Chipper Jones, but right to the side is my head. And so I have to, I know I've sometimes wondered, what time is it? And I thought, don't look at your watch. That doesn't look good. And I wonder, I'm pretty hot. I'd like to wipe my brow, but I don't want to do that just now, because, people are looking at me. I'm part of the scenery. I realize at that point, I'm just part of the scenery, but you need to just be, pleasant and there, and not calling attention to yourself. So at that point, you're right. I am sitting there knowing I could be in a little corner in a picture. All eyes are there. You just try to relax and take in the whole moment, but you do recognize, oh wow, I'm front and center for several hours, and I need to represent properly.
Brian, of course, the news came down earlier this week on Wednesday, the decision by the Hall of Fame's board of directors. They voted unanimously to cancel the weekend and postpone this year's class, included as part of next year's class. Your thoughts on the decision, and I know it's disappointing, but I know it's also something that you completely understand.
I think it's the only call to make as we sit here today. And each day things seem to change, and hopefully day by day, week by week, things look better and we're more optimistic. But as we sit here today, and the planning involved with the ceremony and getting the Hall of Famers there and getting fans there, it's hard to envision, impossible to envision getting 75,000 people in one place, this is Derek Jeter's year. Derek Jeter, Ted Simmons, Larry Walker, it's going to be a huge year. And there's no way we can envision that type of crowd bringing everybody together at this point. Now, maybe when we get there, we'll think, something different. But right now, there's just no way, and you can't plan for it. So I think as we got closer to it, I think people understand this is a different year. And the only way to look at it is this kind of extends what I call the golden era of induction weekends. Because as you know, and I've been, I don't know how far you go back, I'm presuming like the 1980s, right? And looking at the ceremony and myself as well, the ceremonies weren't always 40, 45, 50, 55,000 people. It wasn't like this. It was much smaller. Remember even Mike Schmidt, Richie Ashburn. Was that about 35,000 people? Do you recall? I think around.
Well, it was about 50,000.
How many?
Which at the time, I think it may have been a record at the time, but has since been surpassed by the Ripken Gwynn class of 2000.
Right, and that was huge at the time when Schmidt and Ashburn was like, oh my God, this is the biggest crowd we've seen. Then there was the big class of 1999. Remember Yount and George Brett, Nolan Ryan, huge class, big crowd. Then, of course, we got 75, 80,000 people for Ripken and Gwynn. And so that's been the high water mark. But these last few years, again, I knew, Bruce, we'd be looking back and saying, this is the golden era. 3, 4, 5 guys going in each year and all very worthy, and basically 50,000 a pop. Now, we know the Derek Jeter crowd, in normal circumstances would likely be the largest ever. So this extends it. We wanted to do it this year. I hope all of this and all of our experiences in going through this pandemic just makes us appreciate these things more and know that it's not just, it doesn't have to be happening every year. It is a celebration, and it's something that we need to treasure, and that we can come back next year and be stronger than ever, and come back and all enjoy each other's company and treasure it a little more. So I think it just extends it another year. Doesn't end it, just extends it.
Picking up on something you said a moment ago, Brian, it's easy to forget that prior to the early 1990s, the inductions were not at the Clark Sports Center. They were in Cooper Park, basically to the left side of the museum as you're facing the museum from Main Street.
Right.
And they were right on the front steps of the Hall of Fame library. And that park is beautiful. It's a wonderful location, but probably the capacity there, 10,000, maybe a little bit more. And up until, I think it was 1992, when the move was made to the Clark Sports Center, the biggest crowd you could possibly have was in that 10,000 range.
Right. When you look at the photos of, and I was there for one of them, but when you look back now at, I'm thinking mainly of, there's Stan Musial, and there's Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. There's Ted Williams making his famous speech, imploring people to vote in players from the Negro Leagues. That's right there in front of the library. It's just that those little stands, and then people are out hanging in the trees up in Cooper Park. So yeah, it's bigger than ever before. I think the Tom Seaver year was that first big year up at the Clark Center, and that I forget how many people were there at the time, but it felt like baseball Woodstock, which we would later see with 2007. But it was it wasn't always the way it is now. It's bigger, and I like that. I didn't know when I used to do on my local station. I was up at WTZA in Kingston, New York, Bruce, and we would have once a week. I would have a Hall of Fame night, and I would just open up the phone lines. It was a TV show, and open up the phone lines, and we would talk Hall of Fame. Ron Santo, Phil Rizzuto, do they deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? And we would talk about all these borderline Hall of Famers and who we thought should go into the Hall. And I wondered, are we going to be doing this like in years ahead? I really wondered. I didn't think, there was kind of this small group of baseball historians and nerds that loved this stuff. And I wondered if we were going to still be doing it. And it's bigger than ever before. So I like that people love the Hall of Fame. It gives us something, an excuse to talk baseball. It gives us a focus for baseball history. And I didn't know we'd be doing this all these years later.
Brian, let's talk a little bit about your typical day at the MLB Network prior to what's gone on with the coronavirus this year. You've been at the network now since 2011. Initially, you did a show called Clubhouse Confidential. Then you started doing MLB Now in 2013. What would a typical day have been like for you? When did you get in? What do you do in those early hours? People might have the impression, well, you just show up an hour before airtime and do your hour show and then you're out of there. But I suspect it's a bit more complicated.
Yes, it's a tight-knit unit. First of all, the network, while it's a big national network, the people that you work with on a regular basis, your producer, your coordinating producer, your researcher. It's a small team of people that you'll work with on a regular basis. If I'm doing an MLB Tonight, I'll switch over to another group of producers. But for MLB Now, we're kind of the same unit day in and day out. So there is a continuity as to what we're doing today. Each day it's a new panel of guests, first of all. I'm hosting it, but it could be a completely new panel. Maybe you have a day or a week where Joel Sherman is on the show 3 times in a row, or it's Ken Rosenthal, or maybe every day it's a little different. And then maybe it's John Smoltz for 2 days, and then it is Eric Byrnes or Dave Valley, and then it'll switch around. But each day I kind of have a new group, which adds a lot of life to it, because even if you've talked about certain topics, then suddenly, hey, wait, Al Leiter's on the show. I haven't heard his take on this. Or, hey, it's Carlos Pena, and he's been thinking about this, why this pitcher gave up those home runs, and he wants to talk effective velocity or something like that. And you'll have a new group, and you'll have some fresh blood involved and a different take, very different opinions. So we'll have our production meeting, either 11 or noon, right around there. The show is on live at 4, and we'll prepare. If I have now, again, hopefully that day starts with me having written an essay the day before. If news is breaking, you might adjust to it. But you mentioned Clubhouse Confidential. On that show, it was the first show that was based on sabermetrics or analytics, and we wanted to do kind of an essay on something sabermetric, just exploring. And it could be, who's the greatest first baseman of all time, Lou Gehrig or Albert Pujols or Jimmy Fox? It could be, does this team need a third baseman? Or Josh Donaldson is on the free agent market. Let's put him through the shredder, and actually examine what kind of player he is, what type of value he brings, how rare he is or not, what's his age, what's the market like for this, how many teams are available, and kind of just do a real deep dive into a player. More often than not, I will bring that work home with me, spend a few hours researching, writing, come in the next day, we'll have our meeting. I'll have sent my essay in, usually 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, they've got that email. So when they wake up, there it is. I've written most of it. It's there in its framework. And then we have a team of researchers. These guys are terrific. Eric Nays, Nate Currington, who work with me on a regular basis, and they can finish my sentences at this point. And they know, hey, BK, you said he had a strong year. Do you really want to use that word? I'm like, yeah, you're right. And we'll go back and forth on that and try to figure out what the right way is of presenting it, and be careful and be accurate and be precise. And we'll work on that essay, get the graphics team involved, because you can't just be standing there speaking to the camera. You need video. You need lower third graphics to explain and underline your points. You need full screens to show, here's where Josh Donaldson ranks among third basemen in WAR and OPS plus and weighted runs created plus. Here's why there's scarcity or there isn't scarcity at his position at third base, why it's so deep right now. So you'll do all these things and then have to button up that essay. And we used to, on Clubhouse Confidential, tape it and then edit it together and then put the graphics together. It was this painstaking process. We got to a point, Bruce, and this is a testament to how good the people are at MLB Network. I mean everybody, the director, the graphics people, the producers, everybody, that we decided, why don't we try this live?
Mhm.
And it's an intricate thing to hit the video every shot exactly when you want. The graphics come up exactly when you want. But we started doing it, and we pretty much nail it when we do it, because we have a team that's so used to doing it on a regular basis. Sometimes we have to go back, and if I make a mistake, we'll have to go back and, hey, let me fix that. Did I say 7 years or 6 years? And maybe that, but that rarely happens. And more often than not, we tape it live, and boom, that it can run, the rest of the day. And the rest of the day is, once that essay is in the can, as we say, is ready to go and be presented live, then we just talk about the topics that we're going to talk about. And that is a process where you want to hone in on something that you find fascinating. We don't just go in saying, let's talk Red Sox, let's talk Yankees. Well, what's interesting about the Yankees? What's interesting about this race? Or did we expect the Reds to be this good? Or did we expect the Dodgers to be this good? Or, if the essay is on Cody Bellinger and his emergence, let's now talk Dodgers and how they put their roster in place. And I think the people that do the show on a regular basis, whether if it's Joel Sherman or Ken Rosenthal or John Heyman, the guy who are our pundits, they bring a different sensibility to the show. They want to, they have ideas, and they say, why don't we explore this, how they put the team together and why this trade was crucial. And we say, let's go to town on that. And we try to, find fascinating topics and then explore them at length. And we have a whole hour, Bruce. It's a luxury where I always feel like we can really have a good conversation. Most TV things, you're very rushed. On our show, we'd rather do a deep dive into something that's interesting that we'll do differently, and from an analytical sense that Mad Dog is going to do his show differently. IT with Rose and Millar will do their show differently. MLB Tonight does its show differently. And we have our, specific thing that we do, and let's do that. And so that's kind of our day. We have several hours to get it ready, and then we talk about the next day, and I try to prep the next day's essay and just think, what would be interesting? What's the fascinating question here? And then we go out and do it again the next day.
Brian, when you pose a question to one of your panelists, do you know ahead of time what they're going to say? Have you gone through that, or is it more spontaneous? Do you have very little idea of what their answer might be?
That's a good question, Bruce, because our biggest challenge is to not have a terrific meeting. Because we'll have a meeting, our production meeting, and the issue there is we'll say, okay, so let's talk about maybe why the Dodgers are so good. Excuse me. And it's almost better we have to say this to ourselves a lot. Let's not have the conversation here. Let's figure out what we want to talk about, but let's not talk it through. Sometimes it's best, like if we have a member of the panel that couldn't make the meeting and they had some other obligation. And sometimes I even think it's better. Let's give them the topics. And when I'm on the show live, if I'm looking, I always say, I like looking at like Ron Darling and seeing his eyes. He's peering back at me. He's not sure the question I'm asking, and I don't know his answer. I'd rather have that than we did this in the production meeting. We had a raucous meeting. We'll have great conversations and have these, what we say, well, that was a great show. We just had a meeting that's longer than the show. We had an hour and 15-minute meeting, and we had great banter, and we really explored it. But do we feel like we've just done it? So we almost have to say, save it for the show. Save it for the show and bring it out on the show. So it is fresh, and it's kind of that first blush where you have your honest take on it, and I don't know what your answer is going to be, and you can move on with spontaneity.
Let's talk about some of the folks you work with. Very interesting guy is Eric Byrnes. He is a former player, but you've told me that he's become very receptive to the sabermetric way of thinking about things, sabermetric analysis. He's very much a stat guy and very open.
He's part of that generation that, came about. He literally was playing with the Moneyball A's. Yeah. So Eric had a different, was kind of in a pioneering sense where he was playing with the A's, and he said that, he was there, and, Billy Beane and other people would come up to him and talk to him about the emphasis on taking pitches and seeing a third pitch and taking your base and when to steal and when not to steal. And he said they'd never had that approach before in his coming up as a baseball player. So he lived through that revolution. And so he's very open to it. And a lot of times we'll do, like you bring up Eric. Eric also does top 10 right now. He'll have right field or left field, and we'll rank the top 10 players at each position and why. And a lot of times he'll be more hardcore sabermetric than I'll be. He'll say, look at his production, look at this. And I'm saying, yeah, but is he reliable? Like, wait a second, how did that switch around? How did I become like that side of it? But once we're all talking that same language, then we can move on to things like, is the player reliable? Do you think he'll put in the same work this year? What is his track record? Was it one spike year? How often do we see a spike year? Or is this now his new level? And you can ask that about anybody. Christian Yelich, for example, was that a spike year? Does he come back down and be a very good player? Or is he an MVP candidate every single year? What are we seeing in the underlying numbers, like the production numbers, his swing and miss percentage, his chase percentage, things like that? And Eric very much speaks that language. When you talk to players like Eric, especially a hitter like Eric or Carlos Pena, they're very much into that science of hitting. So this is their language. The guys who are just stepping off the field these last few years, they speak that analytics language.
Interesting. He's very much embraced the new school, but as a player, he was very old school, hustled all the time, played with a lot of fire, a lot of intensity.
Well, that's the game. And that's the mix. I think now that's the fascinating part. It's still a physical world. The numbers reflect the action on the field, but they only reflect it. They represent it in an abstract. And by looking at the data, there is a connection between the data and the real world. But you're still operating in the real world. So it's still about your desire and your commitment to your teammates and yourself and your process and how hard you work and your determination and your reliability, playing hurt, showing up. So we can be talking about value of a player, and one player might have great rate stats, but he plays 123 games a season. Another player doesn't have the same rate stats, but he's playing 160. Well, we're talking about a player who's sacrificing himself a little bit because he knows being out there on the field means he doesn't have to be replaced. The so-called replacement player that we talk about, wins above replacement, real world economics. And that's where it is fascinating now. I think talking with the modern player that's just off the field that understands there is a real connection, but it is still a physical game. And it's still about your desire, your commitment, your teammates, the energy with your teammates, the famous clubhouse chemistry. All of that is very much real and alive. But now we can look at it from a framework as well, measuring things in a more dispassionate way and seeing what real value is. And frequently, what we see a great player playing might be a little more subtle because he walks or he doesn't steal bases, but he goes from first to third. A lot of times it's kind of hidden in the background what a valuable player is. It's not as sexy to the eye like Eric was. Eric was, his hair is on fire and he's running, but all right, what is all that effort yielding? And that has to be studied. And I think that's where we are now in baseball, and knowing that it is about analytics, in measuring things, but the game is still very much a physical human game on the field.
Some of my favorite moments on MLB Network, when you get together with this gentleman here, the Mad Dog, Christopher Russo. He likes to call you names and he'll give you a hard time when you come on his program. But I get the sense you guys actually do like each other.
Oh, the thing with Mad Dog is I love Mad Dog. And I respect his knowledge of the history of the game as well, because he will have an incredible recollection of events. Yeah. He'll be bringing up the 1983 American League Championship Series Game 3, and I'm like, wait, what? Who? Wait, did what? And he'll know all this stuff. And he will hearken back to DiMaggio, of course, and his greatness. But you're right. There's love in his heart. And he does it with a wink. We'll have, big time brawls, but I know I go in now when I'm a guest on his show, when I'm doing High Heat, I try to have nothing in front of me. I clear my mind and I just try to be zen, knowing that if he's going to go off, that's his strength. Let him go off. I'll get my time. I almost view it like an interview with Floyd Mayweather, like I did back in the years. Like, hey, clear your mind, don't fight, see what's coming, answer it, try to stay responsible and have fun. And some of the most fun that I have are those, arguments that I have with Chris.
And let's also make it clear, baseball is his favorite sport. And as you mentioned, he loves the history of the game. He has this almost photographic recall of details, but he's seen players going back probably to the late 60s, early 70s, all the way to the current day. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about Mad Dog.
Oh, we had a great time this year. On Top 10 right now, we did an all-time team, live ball era, 1920, the last 100 years. The all-time team, position by position, ranked in order, 1 through 10. And we had great similarities. We're going to have Al Simmons on the list, things like that, But where we differed was, and I think these are good debates. In center field, I had Willie Mays. He had Joe DiMaggio. I had Cal Ripken Jr. He had Derek Jeter. I had Stan Musial in left field, number 1. He had Ted Williams. These are all good debates. Yeah. There's no right or wrong, and that's where I found it most fascinating. Where I think too we differed on Sandy Koufax and his level, all time. Where we had a good Sandy Koufax versus Whitey Ford debate. But these are fun baseball debates. He's extremely passionate. He says I like to bring up cockamamie statistics, and it's the only time I hear the word cockamamie ever. So I can appreciate that. But we had, I thought, great baseball historical debates on measuring all-time greatness.
We want to take some questions through the chat function on your computer screens. And we already have a question in from Rich. And he's making a reference to Brian's writing career. Brian, about 3 years ago, wrote the book Ahead of the Curve, which did very, very well. Rich wants to know from Brian, can you describe your writing process? What was your biggest inspiration in writing the book?
Wow, I thank you for the question. I loved writing the book. I usually save that writing till late at night. Something Tim Kirkchin, my former colleague at ESPN, and he's still there. But he said to me once, Brian, you have to love writing at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was absolutely the case, where I would make my progress late at night, where I would just get into my own head. And what I didn't realize, two of my, my writing inspiration to get to that answer was Bill James and Rob Nyer. And I remember asking them after I had started writing some chapters, and I realized as I was writing, I was learning. I don't know why I thought this, but I really thought, because I write on a regular basis. I'm writing my essays day to day, but it is different when you widen the lens and you're thinking big picture theory on what is valuable, on comparing players, or on why the sabermetric revolution took so long. Why is there a lag time between the information we as humans receive and then the time that we utilize it, whether it's realizing that, hey, there's a live ball we can swing for the fences. Hey, we don't have to have one pitcher pitching 9 innings. We can bring in a relief ace. Hey, on-base percentage is more important than batting average, or at least as important, and we should be looking at it as well. All of these things came about and then took a decade before we started utilizing them. Now, why does that happen when we're out there on the baseball field fighting so hard for every advantage? Why does it take so long to use good information? That was what I eventually made the book about. And I realized as I was writing, I was learning things myself. And I'd asked Bill James and Rob Nyer, two of the preeminent sabermetricians and sabermetric writers, did you find that? And they said, oh my God, yes, of course. When you're writing, you're building on your own knowledge base, getting it down on paper or on screen. That gives you a foundation and you can work off that. If everything we did was orally, we just spoke about it, a lot of it kind of fritters away. When you write it, it has more permanence. Yeah. So I enjoyed writing the book. The only thing I enjoyed more than writing the book was then being able to sign it for people and meeting fans. And Bruce, we were up there in Cooperstown that one time and that was a great time to be at the library and to see people online waiting to get me to sign the book. I was humbled by it. I was thrilled. I can sit there and talk baseball all day. That was my favorite part. And it's also an excuse just to meet people and talk to people and talk baseball with them. I know I did a signing there. I've done signings out on Main Street in front of Willis Money at different times. And I realized, well, this is an excuse to talk baseball with people. People can know I'm going to be here at 1 o'clock and they can come over and talk to me. You can't, if you don't have a book, it's kind of weird. Hey, I'll be here at 1 o'clock. Come talk to me. But with a book, you have an excuse. Hey, you want to talk baseball? Come on up and we'll talk baseball. So that was, the writing was a great learning experience, but getting to meet people who wanted to read the book and get something out of it and talk baseball, that was the biggest thrill.
We have a question from Max. He wants to know, Brian, what was your favorite Hall of Fame speech? And I guess he's not just referring to the time since 17 when you've become the master of ceremonies, but maybe other speeches you've seen in the past as well. Was there one that really jumped out?
Well, a bunch. Bill Mazeroski's was terrific when, he could go about 20 seconds and he just kept breaking down and he couldn't continue. That was the most heartfelt that we've ever seen. I think my favorite, though, was Phil Rizzuto's. It took a long time for the Scooter to get into the Hall of Fame. He missed years to the war. It didn't help his career totals. And it was, if people don't remember now, it was a big controversy back in the day because the Scooter was a great shortstop, won multiple championships, and he was on TV as a great broadcaster with Bill White and Frank Messer. A lot of us in New York grew up listening to him. We loved the Scooter. Finally, he gets into the Hall of Fame. He gets inducted through the Veterans Committee. 1994, I think it had to be 1994. That's when my daughter was born, my youngest daughter, Camille. And I told my wife, because she was number 5, and I told my wife, I know Camille was just born, but I have to go see Phil Rizzuto be inducted.
Yeah.
And she said, well, you can go, but we're coming with you. Like, you're not driving off. We'll all hopped in the minivan and we all drove to Cooperstown with Camille, who is 30 days old. And so we went and saw, we stayed at our bed and breakfast, and it was, of course, brutally hot. And we're there with the baby, and my wife is there with the kids, but she said, go to the ceremony. I went to the ceremony, broiling hot, and Phil Rizzuto killed. He was hilarious. He was as funny as we all thought he would be. It was just, it felt good as a baseball fan, as someone who grew up listening to the Scooter, to see him finally get his day. And he was hilarious. At the time, Bob Uecker's speech was, again, for pure comedy, would rival it. But I'll always remember the Scooter speech and having our youngest daughter there, my wife and 5 kids, trek up there. July 1994.
While we're on the subject of comedy, well, I didn't mean to bring up your baseball card here, not to say that was comic, but I want to talk about your appearance on Brockmire, which I actually just found out about. I've watched some of the Brockmire episodes. I was doing a little research in preparation for today's talk. I didn't realize that you had actually made an appearance, and there you are. You're right next to the legend himself.
That was a great experience. Hank Azaria, Amanda Peet, they were terrific. They kind of shoot that show. It's a small unit. They're very much in it together. Nobody is acting like a big star. Nobody is aloof or in their trailer. They invited us. Hank is a big baseball fan, and he wanted, certain broadcasters and writers there. You can see there's Joe Buck and Tim Kirkchin, and we were thrilled to be a part of it. The show is a little risque, and as we were there, we're thinking, whoa, you're kind of pushing the edges here, but we did what we were comfortable with. And there is something, when I was watching the early parts of that show, that are just very human and that you can relate to as a broadcaster. And that, the Jim Brockmire character having fallen from the major leagues into the minors, that hadn't happened to me, but I definitely came up through small town USA, where you have I would have a camera and I'd be just shooting a high school practice and getting an interview with the local running back. And, so him calling minor league games. So we had the Hudson Valley Renegades in our area doing the Hudson Valley Renegades games. That was big. That wasn't small. So I recognize that, sometimes you're in a small place and you better enjoy where you are and enjoy the craft. And I think the Brockmire character at his most human, where he just loves calling a ball game, right? And he has all those sportscastery sort of cliches, but you have to be, and I know Hank knows this, and I think that's why this is like an homage to his favorite sportscasters growing up. You have to really be paying attention, and you have to be good with words to paint that word picture in describing a baseball game play by play. So I think, beyond the comedy and everything else that happens with the Brockmire show, there's that respect for the play-by-play guy who is honing his craft day after day, who you basically spend the summer with.
Now, in the scene that you did here, does Hank Azaria, who plays Jim Brockmire, does he strictly adhere to the script, or did he ad lib?
He's pretty much on the script. Now, they're in on the writing of it and fashioning it, and some of his best moments will be kind of an inspired thing. The show is done, and I think this is the beauty of the show, is that they're very independent. They're on a smaller place. Hank mentioned, if we were doing a motion picture, you don't mess with anything, and you do take after take. You don't change things. You have to be very careful. With this, they're kind of moving and shaking, and they just want to get things done, get it done the way they planned it. If something comes up where I think this would be funnier, good, do it, boom, right now. And they're kind of, they're more mobile. They're more able to react to things that they might want to do. So there is some ad-libbing, but there's an adherence to the script that they've worked on. And of course, if you're Hank, you can do what you want. He's like Jackie Gleason in The Honeymooners, follow the money. He's the talent. He's the guy that goes through it. And, but it's great to see. It's a very creative process. And I think that's why he's loved doing the show all these years, is that they have a certain control over it, where there's they don't have to go back to a committee and find out, did we say this right? Did we not? Will people not like that? They do things that they think will be funny, that will, lend to the character, and they go with it.
And he's a huge baseball fan, right?
Oh, hardcore.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, a huge fan. I mean, that's to understand and know the intricacies of calling play-by-play. I mean, that's what makes it hilarious, is that he will go off on these tangents of his personal life, and then he'll say, and the 2-2. Outside, now we got a full count. And they'll just go right back to the other part of his life. He understands the intricacies of calling a ball game, and that's been the rhythm of his life.
I wanted to ask you about appearing on a Topps card. We had Jason Stark on our virtual Voices of the Game last week, and he talked about being featured on an Allen and Ginter style card. You got to be on the Topps card. Tell us about this.
Oh, I never saw that coming, that I'd be on a baseball card. I don't know, maybe, it's not as big as a Mike Trout card. I get it. Or a Joey Votto card, but it was a thrill to be on that. There's that card. There's another card where it's on MLB Tonight. I'm there with Sean Casey, I think Dan Plesac, and it's a big thrill. I still have my baseball cards, Bruce. I know you're big on cards and you do the card columns. I still have my black border 1971s. So that, I'm big on the Topps cards. I still have them. I still remember opening up from a pack of Hank Aaron 1971 and blowing my mind. And so I love baseball cards. It was an honor to be able to do it and be a part of it.
What's on the back of the card?
My card?
Yeah.
Wow, I don't know. I haven't looked in a while. You tell me. How are my stats?
No statistics, right? Just a biography, or
so.
Maybe a cartoon?
I don't think you go back to my age 10 season was pretty good, but I don't know if that was reflected in the card. I haven't looked in a while. I'm sorry.
Final question for Brian Kenny, and we do appreciate his time over the last hour. Next year will be an interesting situation. We'll have the combination of the 2000 class and whoever emerges from the ERA committee, and then, of course, the Baseball Writers Association vote in January. I don't have a vote. You don't have a vote, but you're always very interested. Any thoughts on what might transpire next year?
I wonder, Bruce, if writers will be influenced by the ceremony being pushed back a year. They're only human. And I think, let's say Derek Jeter, Larry Walker, and Ted Simmons, Marvin Miller were all honored this year. We had the ceremony, huge crowd, everything went off as planned. I think next year, a writer would be looking at Curt Schilling at the precipice, and also then Bonds and Clemens below. The new first-year players on the class, there's not a slam dunk Hall of Famer, but I think there would be, you do feel some sort of obligation to give a vote to somebody. You don't have to, and I know they all feel like it's a very exclusive club. We're here to honor that. But I think there would be a feeling of, I should vote for somebody, because the ballot has cleared off quite a bit over the last few years. And I wonder if a writer, I don't know this, I'm just asking, if a writer would be influenced knowing that, well, this year Jeter and Walker are going in. This is still their year. Do I give an extra vote? Now, I'm very big on the players like Scott Rowland, Billy Wagner, Andrew Jones, and you have to make sure that they get enough votes to stay on the ballot and hopefully move up. But I wonder if writers will be influenced by that.
Our guest has been Brian Kenny, and although MLB Network is in somewhat of a quarantine mode, as we all are at this point, still been doing appearances. Brian has on social media, Facebook, that sort of thing. So we'll continue to look for you there, Brian. We're all hoping for a baseball season, and if and when that happens, looking forward to seeing you in the studio again. Thank you, Brian. Always appreciated.
Bruce, love talking to you, and I hope to see you in Cooperstown at some point soon. Hopefully that won't be too long. Take care, Bruce.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. We do appreciate your time. Brian Kenny of the MLB Network has been our guest on Virtual Voices of the Game. We do appreciate his time and your questions via chat. And a reminder, next week we'll be doing the program at 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And our very special guest will be Janet Marie Smith, currently working for the LA Dodgers, instrumental in renovations at Dodger Stadium. Also, of course, one of the driving forces behind the creation of Camden Yards back in the early 1990s. So that's coming up next week. We hope you've enjoyed the program with Brian Kenny. Have a great day, everyone.